We go to my favorite game. That this is kind of what this series was made for. We have the huge games, the ones that everybody remembers watching, but there's also these little quirky ones that it's somebody's favorite, and it's a lot of fans of the team we're talking about. It's their favorite game, but maybe you didn't watch it, or maybe you don't even remember watching this one. But I guarantee you saw the ending to this one. And if it had gone a little bit differently, it's one of those endings that would be replayed every single year. It would be a world famous all-time college football play. But if it had worked, we wouldn't be having Sean Callahan on to talk about it. Sean Callahan from Husker Online. We're talking, of course, of the 2005 Michigan-Nebraska Alamo Bowl. And before we get started, Sean, I want to explain. We'll take the folks behind the curtain because I gave you the option of picking your game. And you said it was either going to be this one or it's going to be the 2009 Big 12 championship game. And my thing was, I don't know if we can do a game Nebraska lost. But I was thinking about it. The 2009 Big 12 championship game, everybody had seen Ndamukong Suh against Texas. Crazy game. I didn't want a bunch of Nebraska fans mad at me afterward, but I see where you're going with, where you're going with that.
In the context, that one extra second that was put on the clock that allowed Texas to win the game, that was kind of the domino that began conference realignment. Nebraska felt like the Big 12 was against them, and everything was kind of going against them at that point. And their star had really risen to its highest point with Ndamukong Suh, and they became very attractive. And the Big Ten, once they showed interest, was interested in them. And that was really, I mean, you can argue Colorado and some other teams also left at that point, but Nebraska losing to Texas that night, what I felt like was an ultimate domino that began this conference realignment world that we live today still.
Yeah. And the Big Ten shortly after that puts out a release basically saying, hey, we're in the market for more schools. Nebraska was the school they wound up taking at that time. But yeah, I had a hard time doing one that they lost. I wanted to do one that they won. And I want to talk to you about this, Sean, because, we've done a few of these and you've been covering the Huskers for a long time, but I think, a lot of people would say, well, how come not the 95, the national title game after the 94 or the 95 season? How come not one of those Orange Bowls? How many Nebraska fans really remember that? Like, if we're talking about the age range of the people who might watch this show.
Right. I mean, you're right. I mean, you're talking several years ago, and I was in 8th grade when they won the 95 national championship, and sophomore year in high school when they won the 97. And I'm going to turn 44 this year. So yeah, you're dating yourself a little bit. And those were special wins. There's no doubt about it. I mean, seeing Nebraska go into Miami in the Orange Bowl and beat Warren Sapp and Ray Lewis in the manner they did, with essentially fullback trap plays to Corey Schlesinger.
Corey Schlesinger, I love that game.
And Warren Sapp running out of gas late in that game. I mean, that was a legendary scene on the sideline of Warren Sapp having to take oxygen because he was so exhausted by the end of that game. And the Peyton Manning win in '97. You're right. I mean, those are legendary wins in this program. That's why there still is great hope and optimism for this team to this day, because so many people lived that era and they know how special this place can be if Nebraska got back competing at that level again.
Well, let's set up the game we're going to talk about. This is 2005 Alamo Bowl, Nebraska, Michigan. Both teams are 7-4. Michigan has not had a great year. They're about to be really good the following year. 2006, it's basically a collision course between Michigan and Ohio State to see who's going to play for the national. Whoever wins the Big Ten is playing for the national title. And this is the guts of that team. Chad Henne, Mike Hart, Jake Long, Mario Manningham, Steve. I think Steve Breston was a senior, but Alan Branch, Lamar Woodley. This is a good Michigan team. And then Nebraska is in year 2 of Bill Callahan. So I imagine it's still really weird at this point for Nebraska fans to watch this style of football after seeing Osborne and Frank Solich and the option for so long.
Yeah, this was year 2 of Bill Callahan, and year 1 was really tough because they didn't have a quarterback. They tried to bring in a junior quarterback at that time named Jordan Adams, and he got mono and had to have, I believe, his spleen removed.
Oh God.
And so like that, he never competed for the job. So they had to go with Joe Daly as their quarterback, and he was not a West Coast offense quarterback. And Bill Callahan really, really tried to make that work. It didn't work in 04. They added a Harrison Beck as their prize recruit for 05, but then out of nowhere late, they take this guy by the name of Zach Taylor. He grew up next door neighbors to Gary Gibbs in Norman, Oklahoma. His dad was a captain for Barry Switzer in the 70s. So he was a true Oklahoma Sooner fan. In fact, in 2004, he watched the Nebraska-Oklahoma game in the stands in Norman as an OU fan on a break from Butler Community College. Then by 05, he was the starting quarterback against Nebraska against Oklahoma.
That it's crazy. So Zach Taylor went to Norman High School in Norman, Oklahoma, goes to Wake Forest out of high school, leaves Wake Forest, goes to JUCO, winds up going to Nebraska because, Bill Callahan feels like he's a better trigger man for the offense. Now, if you're going Zach Taylor, that name's familiar. Yes, we are talking about the Cincinnati Bengals head coach.
Yeah, Zach Taylor, and they wanted a mature quarterback, kind of a guy that knew how to run a complicated offense. Well, he's obviously that to this day. He's a very good offensive coordinator in the NFL. So Zach Taylor comes in, wins the job, gets off to somewhat of a slow start, just learning this offense that Bill Callahan was literally running with the Raiders 2 years before that in the Super Bowl. And it took somebody like Zach Taylor. And as that year moved on, you started to see Zach Taylor get better and better and better, to the point where it really peaked at Colorado. Nebraska was a 2-touchdown underdog in Boulder, against a Colorado team that had already clinched the Big 12 North at that time. And they went in there and won by like 30 points. And they called it the Restore the Order game at that time. And they had t-shirts but Zach Taylor was unbelievable. And then that kind of carried over to the bowl game, where they get this opportunity to play Michigan, who really didn't want to be in the Alamo Bowl, or Nebraska. No. They were excited to get back to a bowl game because they didn't make a bowl game in 2004.
Yeah, Michigan had a disappointing season. Like Jake Long, for example, was the right tackle that year. He becomes the left tackle after this. Goes on to be the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. But he was out a lot of that season, which they felt hamstrung their offense. One thing I noticed watching this game, Sean, though, very aesthetically pleasing football. Like for some reason, I was remembering Lloyd Carr era at Michigan as a kind of boring, but like their offense was fun to watch.
The way he used the tight ends in that game too. I mean, he had a lot of great concepts, and I mean the speed that Michigan had at skill.
Yeah.
And Nebraska didn't have near the talent of Michigan in that game. And Bill Callahan schematically figured out a way to put them in place. And they felt like the Michigan defense was talented, but they couldn't run very well. So their whole plan was Corey Ross was finally healthy and running really well at that point. And they're like, we're going to really make them chase Corey Ross, who was, he was like a 5'4" running back, almost like a heavier.
I love Corey Ross. I had forgotten till I rewatched this game how much I loved watching Corey Ross run.
He was like Deuce Vaughn, but a little heavier. His nickname was Pork Chop, and Pork Chop just ran all over Michigan in that game. And, they tired out, and then Zach Taylor got hot, and Bill Callahan knew how to Bill Callahan could draw up plays as well as anybody, and
still can.
And he knew exactly how to go at Michigan, and attacked what they were doing because of that NFL kind of preparation mentality he had. And there was never a better coach at a 15-play script than Bill Callahan. His out of the gate scripts were some of the best you'll ever see. And he came in with a plan on how to go at Michigan. This is a Michigan team that probably had 20 or 30 NFL draft picks on its roster.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So again, like I said, they were a very good team in 2006, this Michigan team. And a lot of these guys were on the 2007 team that lost to Appalachian State. And they got crushed by, Oregon, which had just gotten Chip Kelly as the OC, but then went on to have an incredible year in 2007 after the horrific start. So like these were really good players. You're not kidding. Like you're talking about big time NFL players here.
And Nebraska didn't. Nebraska had some NFL talent. Like Ndamukong Suh was a true freshman I believe, on this Nebraska '05 team. And they had this '05 recruiting class is still the gold standard of recruiting classes. It produced 2 Big 12 players of the year, and Ndamukong Suh and Zach Taylor. Zach Taylor is still the last Nebraska player to win a conference player of the year on offense. So, that's '06 when he won that award. But that team Bill Callahan built a really good team, and that was like the beginning of it. The '07 season, obviously, they never could overcome that, because in '06, they played with anybody on their schedule, and they easily could have been a 12-win team in '06, and they blew a couple of games late. That kind of changed the course of that year. But that '05 team, I think, really showed you what they could be. They matched up really well defensively against Michigan, even though Michigan had significant advantages in some of the skill position players and their offensive line play. But Nebraska still got lots of pressure on Chad Henne in that game.
Oh, yeah. And that's very important. Like, as we talk about the game, there's one play in particular late in the game. Like, Nebraska does not win this game without the pressure it's getting. But you mentioned that Bill Callahan was a great, opening script guy, and that Nebraska struck first in this game, busted coverage right over the middle. It was like, okay, this might look easy.
Yeah, he came out and just knew how to go at their coverages. And, keep in mind, Kevin Cosgrove, the defensive coordinator, was at Wisconsin for many years. So, and Bill Callahan had a Big Ten background. So they had a lot of familiarity with Michigan on that staff at Nebraska. Phil Almatian was at Purdue. You go down the line, they had a number of guys on that Nebraska '05 staff that were very aware of Michigan and kind of how they operated, because they didn't really change a lot at Michigan over that time. They were very traditional, very buttoned up. And Nebraska had never been that style. And Nebraska has never been a pro-style program until Bill Callahan gets there. So, he takes out like what Frank Solich and Osborne had done for years and, puts them in this pro-style system. And it was a massive adjustment, but eventually it started to take hold. And it started with the quarterback play. Zach Taylor could at least get the ball out and operate. He didn't have a pro arm, but he had an elite mind, and he could get the ball out.
Yeah, because you could see that. You can see that watching this game, because, like you said, the Michigan defensive players are more talented than their Nebraska counterparts on offense. But Zach Taylor is so good at knowing where to go with the ball and when to do it, that it sort of negates that physical advantage that Michigan had. Now, not always, because so Nebraska scores, and then it becomes Zach Taylor throwing to Leon Hall. Like, he throws to Leon Hall, gets picked. Michigan misses a chip shot field goal, which becomes very important later. Then he throws another pick to Leon Hall, and this time Michigan scores, and then you got to tie a game.
Yeah, Nebraska overcame a lot of. I remember thinking to myself, there was a point in that game like, it's over. Nebraska's not going to win this game. You could just sense it tilting to Michigan at points. Even late in the fourth quarter, it felt like Michigan had the game won, or in parts of the fourth quarter. So for it all to really come together in the way it did, and every time they kicked off to the kick returners, you could just see the level of skill. Nebraska's special teams unit were a lot of just in-state walk-on, guys that were not high-level pro pedigree bodies that were making plays trying to tackle guys that ran 4.3 40s. Who was it? Was it Breston? Was that their kick returner?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He was ridiculous.
Yes. Yeah, and because Breston's the old guy receiver and Manningham's the young guy, and they were very difficult to deal with, and you could tell where the speed gap was, but Nebraska just kept coming. You had at this point, Michigan takes the lead on a Manningham touchdown in the back of the end zone that is just an incredible catch. It's one of those give me that ball Moss situations, and now couple plays in the back of the end zone, very important, because you had the Manningham touchdown, but then Nebraska has an interception that, if not for replay, isn't an interception.
Yeah, and that replay was very new at that point.
Yeah.
It wasn't, it might have been in its first year, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it also negated a Michigan pick six, because there was I think it was the second Leon Hall interception, where he gets it, and his knee's on the ground when he catches it. And so they bring it back.
Because ESPN aired that game, they had more cameras and more angles, where if that was your standard like Fox Sports package game back then, they may not have had all the angles, but that game had Mike Tirico, Kirk Herbstreit,
Aaron Andrews.
Was Aaron Andrews on the sidelines?
Yeah, she was.
So I mean,
it was an all-star team.
At the time when that game was over, it was ESPN's highest rated bowl game in history. This is pre BCS bowl game era when ESPN didn't get those. So I mean, yeah, the stage it was on, I mean, it was an elite stage. The Alamo Bowl was full too. I mean, I'll never forget.
Oh, it was loud.
How many Nebraska fans went down there because they had just beaten Colorado, and just the excitement Nebraska fans had. They loved that bowl. I wish the Big Ten, or hope the Big Ten can get the Alamo Bowl back, because that was always a great bowl game for Nebraska.
Well, it's kind of the perfect set, because it's a great walkable downtown. There's plenty of hotels. There's room, and it's actually, I believe, kind of a slow time of the year there, so you can get a decently priced hotel room. So you can walk around the Riverwalk. There's tons of restaurants, fun things to do. You can walk to the stadium, and the stadium's not huge, but it's big enough, and it gets really loud if there's most of the seats full. And so it's perfect if you've got a decent sized fan base, or if you've got, let's say, a Nebraska coming to play a team, in this case, Michigan, but let's say a Nebraska playing a more local team, like if Texas A&M were in it or something like that, if that's who they wind up going with. It's crazy. We don't even know what the bowl alignments are going to be down the road, but it can be super fun. Like, remember the RG3 Alamo Bowl? Like, that one was wild, and that the fans are going nuts in that one too.
Yeah, and the old Big 12, it was just such a natural bowl game for that league. And they would play a Big 10. Nebraska played in that game 3 times, and all 3 times they won. They beat Michigan State with Pelini, and then they beat Northwestern when Northwestern shared the Big 10 championship in 2000. Dominic Raiola was on that team for Nebraska. So they were 3-0 in that game, and all 3 of those times, there easily had to be 30 to 40,000 Nebraska fans that made the trip to watch those games in the Alamo Bowl. And this one was no different because of the momentum Nebraska had, just winning at Colorado to end the year. You kind of felt like things were turning a corner under Bill Callahan at that point. And this was rare. Nebraska and Michigan, they had the history going back to 97. And these 2 teams split the national championship. Nebraska won the coaches poll. Michigan won the AP poll. So they were split national champions in 97. And this would have been their first time ever playing since then. And we did a story back then on Husker Online where we did a roundtable with 3 or 4 Michigan players and 3 or 4 Nebraska players, just like who would win that game. And it was back and forth. And we actually interviewed Scott Frost on the roundtable back then.
Wow.
About Michigan, Nebraska.
Who would have won that
97 game?
That would have been a really fun game. Like, that would have been a fun game to put in the Alamo Bowl. Like, to be perfectly honest, you put it in that stadium, but you would have filled the Rose Bowl if you could have gotten those 2 together. And man, that would have been unbelievable. But what you got instead is, years later, you have this crazy, crazy game. So I mentioned that Mario Manningham catch. So that Mario Manningham catch in the back of the end zone happens with 6:31 to go in the 3rd quarter. It makes it, after the extra point, it's 21-17 Michigan. And then Michigan scores again to make it 28-17. And you mentioned feeling at times like in the 4th quarter, this game was over. So when that score happens, there's 11:40 to go in the 4th quarter. So much happens in that last 11:40.
Yeah, at 28-17, though, the way Michigan played and how disciplined they usually were, it should have been over. And that's why I always will remember this game. I'm like thinking to myself, there's no way Nebraska's going to have a chance to come back and win this game. And then, Corey Ross obviously breaks off a big touchdown run, and Michigan's defense started to get tired, and they started to have some breaks. And Nebraska obviously got the ball back again one more time to put the game away. And then their defense came up with stops. And I mean, it just was one of the more memorable 4th quarters of a game, in a game that really didn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but it was very entertaining. And it was 2 of the winningest programs in college football.
Yeah.
At that time, rarely played against each other.
So, like you said, Corey Ross has the nice touchdown run where he kind of breaks loose down the left side. Michigan gives it back a couple times. The second time, though, is the one, another replay one, by the way. Another replay. Now, I think they initially called this a fumble on the field, but replay confirms it because Tirico and Herbstreit were like, this isn't a fumble. This is an incomplete pass, because it was Henne was going back to throw, and the Nebraska defender gets him. He gets his hand on the ball before Henne can get the ball up above his shoulder. And it's a great shot. And you mentioned earlier, and let's explain this, Sean, as you and I are old guys in our 40s. Let's explain to the young folks what it used to look like watching a game. Like, there used to be like 3 cameras at a football game.
And they were very low quality. I mean, you think about Nebraska pretty much would have won another national championship in 1982 if there was replay. Penn State was out of bounds on any angle you ever watch in the 82 Nebraska Penn State game, and they counted it, and Penn State won the game on that play. And if there was replay, the play doesn't happen. And that 82 team is one of the more talented Nebraska teams in history, with Mike Rozier, Irving Fryer, Gale. You go down the line, Dave Remington, Baker Stein, or Dean Steinkooler, Roger Craig, and they lost on a phantom call at State College that if there was replay in that era, it doesn't happen. And Tom Osborne may have won his first national championship in 1982.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's just wasn't the capability wasn't there. You couldn't have gotten a crisp enough shot on a lot of these things.
No.
And that's what, like you mentioned, replay is a relatively new thing. HD technology is relatively new. Like, I remember covering the 2009 Alabama LSU game, and we were shocked to find out that at that point the SEC still hadn't switched to HD technology in the replay booth, because there was an interception or not in that game that was very controversial. And they're like, we don't have an HD shot. But the TV
and this
did.
Game would have been HD. I mean,
right. This would have been one of the early HD games, one of the first ones,
because you had ESPN's prime setup there. I mean, It was like their Sunday Night Football level setup at the Alamo Bowl.
And the replay on this fumble, because this was probably the most important play of the game, because at this point, Michigan's still winning. They can put this away probably because of the way they play, because of the running game they have, the offensive line they have. But if this is a fumble, Nebraska gets it and they still have a chance. And it was a perfect shot where you could see the ball perfectly. It has not gone above Chad Henne's shoulders yet. He's not moving forward with his arm. It's a fumble. And Nebraska gets the ball back, and Zach Taylor takes him down the field.
And it was Blake Tiki on the hit, right? If I remember right.
I believe so, yeah.
A walk-on safety, just like a no-name guy making a play on an NFL high-level. I mean, just you had a lot of guys like that stepping up in that game. But yeah, that final drive, just the way Zach Taylor, found Terrence Nunn for that final touchdown. I mean, it just was such a great moment at that time, just to see Nebraska drive down there and execute in that moment and put the game away. At least he felt like it was put away at that point. Yeah. When he found Terrence Nunn, just with that strike right over the middle. All right,
let's get to the final play, because that's really that's where this game goes completely off the rails. It's what Scott Van Pelt calls pitchy woo woo. It is, had this worked, it would have been up there with Cal Stanford and the band is on the field. It would be one of those that is replayed in any highlight package involving college football ever. So Michigan runs a fairly conventional for a hook and lateral play, but Henne throws over the middle. Pitt, I believe the Pitt, it was breast and catching, pitching to Manningham, and then all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, just a ultimate rugby play, and there were about 2 or 3 moments where okay, it's over. And the fact that Michigan just kept it alive, I think everybody was in disbelief. I mean, the Nebraska players were in disbelief. You saw, Nebraska should have been penalized. I mean, they were on,
like Nebraska's sideline, like all the players had come onto the field. So what happened toward the end of the play? So I don't even remember I have to look up where the play started. I'll tell you in a second the play started on Michigan's 37-yard line. They actually get it across midfield. I want to say they get it into the 40s, maybe even the 30s, in Nebraska territory, and then they start going backward. And they're back behind the original line of scrimmage. They're probably in like the 25-yard line, the Michigan 25. And there's a player over on the far sideline, which is Nebraska sideline, who throws it backward. It's still legal. Like, they haven't made it a legal forward pass yet. And it falls incomplete, but it's not incomplete because it's a fumble, because it's backward. And so, like, a lot of the Nebraska players, and I think some of the officials, and definitely at least one Michigan offensive line, which I think was Jake Long, because you see him just sort of standing with his hands on his hips, like, guess this is done. And Tyler Ecker is the player who picks it up for Michigan and just takes off like a bat out of hell toward the left sideline. And he's going, and he's like weaving through Nebraska players who aren't even in the play. They're just wandering around because they came off the sideline.
Yeah, it was the fact that and then all he had to do was make one more pitch back and they win the game.
Yeah. Zachary Bowman is the Nebraska player who knocked him out. I don't think Ecker saw Bowman. Bowman had like the perfect, and Bowman, like, if you ever saw the Terry Tate Office Linebacker series, it is one of those hits to knock him over the sideline.
And Bowman was a dude. I mean, he was a 5-star junior college corner, played in the NFL. So, like, I mean, he was not going to be easy to get by at that moment. I believe Titus Brothers was in the area too. I mean, he was a San Antonio kid that played for Nebraska. But, you know, just to see that all play out, because literally, you're right. I mean, we'd be talking about this play for 100 years if Michigan just makes one more pitch.
It's insane. Now, I got to ask you, what is it like watching that? Because the game's over.
You know how it is. You're down on the sideline at that point. So, like, you're almost kind of like, wait a minute. Like, it was just the way I don't, it was almost disbelief. Like, you're like, wait, they're almost going to do that. Like, you almost, then when Nebraska gets out of the situation there, you're like, wow, like, that almost just happened. I mean, probably like what Auburn and Alabama fans felt like on the kick six or when they ran that. But I mean, you just a disbelief moment where you're like, there's no way. Or even this past year when Alabama was it fourth?
Oh, the 4th and 31. Yeah, fourth and goal from 31. Yeah.
You know, it just should never. I mean, one in 1,000, this thing happens, and it almost happened in that situation.
Yeah, it's just wild. Now, coming off that win, where's Nebraska at? Because if that's the sort of like, that's the kind of bowl win. And I don't know if we're going to do this anymore. Like, I don't know how this is going to work in the 12-team playoff era. But back in the day, that was the kind of bowl win where you go, that's the one you can build on. Like, that's how you build your, like, Bill Callahan's going places with Nebraska.
Yeah, that win at that moment. So going into 06, they had a really, really good team. I mean, lots of NFL talent. I mean, their defensive front returned Adam Carricker and Jay Moore and Stuart Bradley. All three of those guys played in the Senior Bowl that year. So, like, high-level NFL draft picks. They returned Zach Bowman at corner, and they had a number of really good linebackers coming back. Corey McEwen was all Big 12 at that time. Bo Rude, you know, they were loaded across the board on that defense. Zach Taylor comes back. They add Maurice Purify, the best junior college receiver. That was a team that went, I believe, 10-4 the next year in 06. But they blew a huge lead at Oklahoma State. They blew the Texas game. Terrence Nunn gets a first down to ice the game, and he fumbles the ball. And Texas gets the ball back to win the game in Lincoln. The only team that really handily beat that Nebraska team that year was USC. They went out to the Coliseum, and they played a peak Pete Carroll level team.
Yeah.
And that's when they were at a whole nother level. But that was a Nebraska team the next year that easily could have and should have won the Big 12. They went to the championship game. They played the Oklahoma team that Rhett Bomar was suspended on for the car thing. And I believe Paul Thompson was the quarterback that year.
Right, yeah.
So they had a converted wide receiver.
That's the Oklahoma team that wound up playing Boise State.
Correct. And you could argue that Oklahoma team, in terms of Big 12 champions of that era, was probably one of the weaker Big 12 champions.
Right. Adrian Peterson was on the team, but was out for a lot of that season. Now he was playing at that point. I know he played in the bowl game.
Yeah, I don't think he played in the Big 12 title. It was freezing cold in Arrowhead Stadium.
Right.
And Nebraska had 60,000 fans in Arrowhead. It was unreal, and they blew that opportunity. So Bill Callahan, he talked about guys that were close. He brought talent to Nebraska, gets them into Arrowhead in front of 60,000 Nebraska fans in attendance, and they blew it against Oklahoma. They had every opportunity. They fumbled the opening play of the game, and Oklahoma jumped up 7-0. And from that point, that Nebraska still could. They were close. They still couldn't pull it out in the end. But yeah, that 05 game really set up a year in 06 where Zach Taylor was the Big 12 Player of the Year. Nebraska won the North, and they easily could have been in one of those BCS bowl spots back then.
And it was one of those times, and this would kind of hit Nebraska a few more times before this lull that they're currently in, where it would be like they were about to turn the corner, and then they just didn't. And that's where I now I feel like they're back in the about to turn the corner mode.
Right. Yeah. You have the feeling with Dylan Raiola and so much hope and optimism of what he's brought to the quarterback position. Now he's not named the starter yet, but usually your eyes don't lie. And he brings some intangibles that we haven't seen at that position. And they've upgraded the receivers. They've got a very good defensive group returning. I mean, I think this is a defense that could easily contend to be in the top 10 nationally. Especially when you look at their schedule. They don't see a lot of elite offenses. They do play Colorado and they do play Ohio State, but they have a real opportunity to have one of the better defenses in the conference. And Dylan Raiola can do things at the quarterback position that we just haven't seen. So, this has a feeling of turn the corner for Nebraska, especially when you look at the first 7 games and the opportunity they have there in each one of those first 7 games.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting because if you read my calling my shot predictions for the season earlier this week, I did say I think Nebraska might go 7-0 to start the 2024 season. Now it's not a gimme. That's not a given.
No,
I definitely think it's possible.
Indiana, they're talking. Indiana fans have a lot of optimism, like that they have more on that roster than I think most understand. And I do think Rutgers and Lincoln will be a hard game, as you know.
Yep. Rutgers is better than people realize.
And Purdue's offense, I don't think they got their best receiver was out last year. He's back off injury. So
and Hudson Card's better. Yeah.
Purdue will have a very good improved offense. Now their defense is questions. In Colorado, who the hell knows what that team's going to look like?
Exactly. So we shall see, but this does feel like we're in that mode again of this is where Nebraska can turn the corner. So we will see if they can. Didn't happen after the Alamo Bowl, but we always remember the Alamo Bowl. I'm sorry, I had to. I'll see myself out. Sean Callahan, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.